It wasn't supposed to be heard. The city of Austin in 1857 was a breeding ground for two things: manifest destiny and secrets no scripture could absolve. But this secret, was different. Because when the Sullivan estate was finally pried open by authorities, what they found beneath the floorboards was not a cellar. It was a tomb, alive, groaning, soaked in filth, iron, and terror. 23 children. Chained. Half-starved. Silent not from fear but training. And all of them, when asked who had done this, whispered the same thing. Not a name. Not a person. Just a word. Mother. And yet there are no court records. No trials. Just one sheriff's log hidden in a box labeled Incomplete Disasters. The pages? Half burned. Half soaked in what looks like wax, or dried blood. The house itself was burned to ash just 3 days after the discovery. No living Sullivans remained. No graves. No memorial. As if the entire family was erased from history by something older than law, something with influence, something that didn't want anyone looking deeper. But here's what they didn't erase. The land was never resold. Locals say animals avoid it. Trees twist in unnatural ways around the property's edge. And every few decades, someone finds a child's bracelet buried 6 inches under the dirt, rusted shut. A few even say they've heard singing at night. In Latin. Children's voices, but off, like they're mimicking a language they never learned. This isn't folklore. This is a rot at the roots of American history, of the systems we were taught to trust. The Sullivan family wasn't just sick, they were part of something. A network. Ritualistic. Strategic. And all of it centered on one purpose: control through trauma. These children weren't just victims. They were test subjects. And someone somewhere was documenting every outcome. You're not supposed to know any of this. And if you walk away now, you can keep pretending the past was righteous, that your ancestors weren't pawns in something monstrous. But if you're ready to go further, if you're ready to learn the reason why these children were kept alive, then stay. Because we're only just now opening the first door. And what waits behind the others rewrites everything. The Sullivan family arrived in Austin in the spring of 1839, just after Texas declared independence. Official records list them as traveling land developers, but no one remembers them ever developing anything. Ezra Sullivan was quiet, reserved, and wealthy beyond what made sense for the time. His wife, Isadora, was far stranger. Pale as porcelain, always dressed in black, even in sweltering summer, and never seen eating in public. But what disturbed people most wasn't how she looked. It was how children reacted around her. Infants screamed when she passed. Older ones froze. Some even wept. One child, a preacher's boy, swore she had no shadow during daylight. His father whipped him for lying. The couple purchased 300 acres on the outskirts of Austin, surrounded by dense woods. They named the estate Providence Field, and built a sprawling manor atop a series of limestone caves. Locals thought the name odd. Providence meant divine blessing. But no one who saw the estate up close felt anything holy about it. It was always cold. Even in July. Livestock kept dying without wounds. Dogs refused to go near the place. But money talks, and the Sullivans had enough of it to hush suspicion. They hired locals to build fences, clear trees, dig. Never let anyone inside the manor. By 1841, they claimed to be caring for orphans. Only a few at first, 4, maybe 5. All girls. All mute. Locals assumed they were victims of war or disease. But the numbers kept growing. By 1850, whispers said there were dozens. No one had ever seen more than a few at a time, always pale, always silent, always walking in pairs. It was the town's worst-kept secret. Everyone talked, but no one acted. Because every time someone got too curious, they either left town, or were found dead in the Colorado River. Face down. No signs of struggle. And always with wax sealed over their ears. This wasn't charity. It was a program. And the Sullivans weren't working alone. Clergymen from New Orleans were seen entering the estate at night. Men in black coats carrying crates. Latin murmured behind closed windows. Some said it was a religious sect. Others whispered it was government. But the most terrifying theory? That it was both. and that the children were being trained, not saved. Do you feel it yet? That itch in your brain telling you something deeper is moving behind all of this? Good. Don't scratch it. Let it burrow. It wasn't until 1856 that someone finally broke the cycle of silence. Her name was Clorinda May Ellis, and she was just 12 years old. She stumbled into town barefoot, her mouth torn open at the corners, wrists raw from restraint, and eyes blank. Not empty, just blank, like no one was home. The town doctor examined her and claimed she was in a state of induced catatonia. But when she was left alone with the preacher's wife, she whispered 3 words in perfect Greek: Thalassa tu oris. Sea of the mountain. Nonsense? Not quite. That phrase appears in one text. Only one. A forbidden translation of the Testamentum Arcanum, a scroll allegedly smuggled out of a burned monastery in 1324, said to contain methods of disassembling the soul from the will. No 12-year-old girl from Austin should have known that, especially not in perfect pronunciation. Clorinda was placed in the town's care, but never spoke again. She stopped eating. Her eyes began bleeding on the 3rd night. By the 5th, her teeth had all fallen out. On the 6th, she vanished. Doors locked. No forced entry. No footprints. Only one thing left behind: a wax seal. Pressed into it was the image of a serpent eating its tail, surrounding a pair of eyes stitched shut. From that moment, the town understood. This wasn't just criminal. It was ritual. And rituals are designed with purpose. That meant the Sullivans weren't torturing these children for pleasure. They were conditioning them. Clorinda was likely a failed subject. And the others? Still deep underground, being molded into something else. If your stomach's starting to turn, it should. Because the question that followed was never, why were they doing this? It was, who were they doing it for? We're about to answer that. The 23 children discovered in the basement weren't random. Not one. A genealogist in 1911, obsessed with the Sullivan case after discovering a half-burned file in an old federal archive, began tracing the surnames of children listed in a sheriff's lost inventory. Only 6 full names were recoverable. But every one of those 6 came from bloodlines tied to colonial dissenters, rebels, whistleblowers, families that questioned church tithes, land grabs, or federal tax policy going back over a century. These children weren't just kidnapped. They were selected. That's when the theory took shape. The Sullivan family may have been part of a psychological filtration system. Target bloodlines. Remove the next generation. Break them. Erase memory. Rebuild them. Reinsert them into society as loyal functionaries. Quiet. Submissive. Disconnected from ancestral rage. The perfect citizen. And here's where it spirals. You know the name Augustus Wren? You should. First director of Texas State Corrections. Founder of 2 psychiatric hospitals. Champion of behavioral correction therapy. He also happened to be a frequent guest at Providence Field. 5 times between 1850 and 1857. There are letters, unpublished, where he praises the early phase experiments of the Sullivan estate. Experiments. That word again. Wren's methods would go on to influence early 20th century mind control research. Yes, including elements we now associate with MKUltra. But the roots? They run through Austin. Through a basement full of broken children who were taught not to feel, not to speak, not to remember. This was never just a cult. It was a template. Want to know the worst part? The children loved her. When survivors were questioned, the few who could speak didn't call Isadora Sullivan a monster. They called her Mother. With reverence, like she was a goddess. That's the point people always miss with control systems. They don't just torture. They reprogram love. Through deprivation, isolation, fear, then reward. One survivor, identified only as Child 11, said this in a 1923 interview. When we behaved, we were kissed. When we cried, we were starved. When we obeyed, she told us we were chosen. Sound familiar? Because that pattern appears in every cultic system from Jonestown to North Korea. But the Sullivan blueprint predates them all. And its greatest weapon wasn't violence. It was dependency. Total psychological ownership. And here's the twist. Some of them wanted to stay, even when freed, even when their chains were removed. You know what that tells us? That the Sullivans weren't experimenting. They were refining. And you need to understand this next part, because once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The Sullivan basement wasn't a prison. It was a school. In 1857, when the children were discovered, there were symbols carved into the walls of the basement. Not pentagrams. Not childish scribbles. Diagrams. Advanced ones. Perfect spirals. Geometric matrices. One symbol appeared 23 times. A modified enneagram, 9 points within a circle but with an inverted core. It matched diagrams found in suppressed documents from the Esoteric Order of the Veil, a secretive sect of Jesuit defectors from the 1700s known to perform will-fracturing liturgies. No one should have known this symbol in Texas. No one. And here's the kicker: the children drew it themselves. Authorities called in theologians, mathematicians. No one could explain it. Then one night a fire tore through the sheriff's office. All records gone. No insurance. No investigation. Just ash. Sound like coincidence? That's the kind of silence only institutions can afford. Because if what was found in that basement had reached the public, people would have started asking the wrong questions. Not about the Sullivans, but about their funders, their protection, their purpose. And this is where I need you to engage. If you've stayed this far, you're not just watching a story. You're being initiated. Drop this phrase in the comments: the chains were not broken. They were redesigned. Say it twice. It locks you in. And more importantly, it flags this video to others who are ready to wake up. Let's talk about the house. It burned 3 days after the discovery. No witnesses. No suspects. The fire was so hot that even the limestone foundation cracked. But here's what they don't tell you: the basement didn't collapse. In fact, to this day it's still there, sealed off, covered by what's now an unmarked federal storage site, designated as historical preservation land. Visitors are not allowed. No photographs. No explanation. What does that tell you? That someone somewhere still values what was underneath. And I'm going to say this once: we've only scratched the surface. The Sullivan story doesn't end in 1857, because fragments of it show up again. In 1892, New York asylum reforms. In 1919, Chicago orphanage fires. In 1954, MKUltra test site blueprints. Every time something new emerges in mind control science, the fingerprints of the past are already there. Always faint. Always hidden. But always present. If you think this was just one evil family in one cursed house, think again. The Sullivans were a node, a test site, and something, was watching their results closely. Subscribe to this channel now if you're ready to keep pulling at this thread, because what we're uncovering, it goes deeper than bloodlines and basements. We're approaching the architecture of control itself. You've been taught to believe in isolated evil. One bad apple. A twisted family. A single, unthinkable crime. But what if I told you that's by design? That the idea of isolated corruption is itself a psychological mechanism, so you never trace the rot back to the tree. Because when you start doing that, you find that it always leads to the same roots. Hidden institutions. Disguised hierarchies. Ancient orders that never needed thrones or titles to rule. They ruled by invisibility. And the Sullivans? They were visible enough to be ignored. That was the point. If you make the horror look like charity, no one asks questions. If you call the dungeon a school, you don't need bars on the windows. If you call the children orphans, no one comes looking. You still think this story is about 1857? Let me ask you something. When you walk into a school today, who's deciding what gets taught? Who funds the textbooks? Who designs the standardized tests that filter children by obedience instead of originality? Who decides what normal behavior is, and what's worthy of medication? This isn't accidental. What the Sullivans did with chains and starvation has been replicated for over a century with bells, labels, and sedation. You're not looking at the past. You're looking at a blueprint that never stopped evolving. So ask yourself, if those children were programmed, then how many generations since have lived their lives inside a similar script? You might be one of them. There was a man named Father Jeremiah Crane. You won't find him in modern seminary records, but he appears in two places: a death ledger from Austin in 1853 and a footnote in the private journals of Augustus Wren. He was a visiting cleric, or so it was claimed. But his presence on the Sullivan estate coincided with a drastic shift in the children's behavior. Before his visits, they were nonverbal, withdrawn. But by the end of his third recorded stay, multiple witnesses claimed the children began speaking again, but only in tandem. One voice, one phrase, repeated nightly. We were born beneath and we remember. No one knew what it meant. But Crane was obsessed with something he called the doctrine of descent. It was his theory that spiritual obedience was best achieved by first fracturing a subject's will, destroying identity, then flooding the void with ritual, repetition, and divine reward. The doctrine was never published. But in Wren's journals he writes, Crane's results with the Sullivan children demonstrate a proof of concept. They are no longer fractured, they are harmonized. They do not think, they recite. The will is no longer divided. Now ask yourself, what was the goal? To erase pain? Or to create perfect vessels for something else? In 1921, a geologist named Lewis Kent was hired to survey old estate lands in western Austin. No one told him about the Sullivans. He was just a scientist studying seismic shifts. But what he found shook more than ground. Beneath the site of the old manor, nearly 200 feet down, he found a cavity that wasn't natural. A geometric chamber. Perfect symmetry. Walls coated in iron-rich residue and symbols etched into the stone. Kent went public. He published early findings in a regional scientific journal. 3 days later, he was fired without cause. 2 weeks later, his home was burned to the ground. His family vanished. No official investigation. But one copy of his journal survived. Inside was a drawing of the chamber. And beneath it, scrawled in red ink, it's not a basement. It's an altar. And it's still warm. So now we ask, what kind of altar is built below a house full of children? And what kind of God is it meant to feed? Let's pause. If this story feels like it's spiraling, it's supposed to. Because that's how the truth feels when you've been lied to your entire life. Disoriented. Heavy. Impossible. But the most dangerous part? It starts to feel familiar. Because you've seen pieces of this before. In the silence around mass abuse scandals. In the erasure of indigenous trauma. In the systems designed not to punish evil, but to recycle it. Let's go back to the Sullivans. After the manor burned down, no graves were found. The parents didn't die. They disappeared. Or were taken. A theory emerged from an anonymous letter sent to the Texas State Library in 1897. The letter claimed that Ezra and Isadora Sullivan were never arrested, never killed, but relocated, given new names, and integrated into a federal program dealing with experimental citizen reform. The author said the Sullivans were no longer needed as handlers. Their design was complete. Now it was time to test the system on a national scale. The next year, compulsory education laws were expanded. Coincidence? Or rollout? Do you remember when I said the Sullivan children were found chained but still alive? Here's something else they didn't publish. Each of the 23 children had a small, matching incision behind the left ear. Surgical. Precise. When examined, doctors found a fragment of metal embedded in each one, so small it was almost undetectable. At the time, it was dismissed as shrapnel. But in 1982, one of the recovered fragments was reanalyzed. It wasn't iron. It was tantalum, a rare, heat-resistant element not known to be in use in 1857. And embedded within it? An impossible structure. A microcircuit, decades ahead of its time. So tell me, what is a 20th century implant doing in a 19th century child? Unless the Sullivans didn't build the technology. They were given it. And suddenly, the silence around this case doesn't just make sense. It becomes terrifyingly logical. You're not looking at a forgotten horror. You're looking at a black site buried in the past. And someone was testing how far the human mind could bend before it broke. Let's talk about the rhythm. Witnesses who survived the basement years later reported that the children were woken every 4 hours by a sound. A low tone like a foghorn mixed with a bell. Always the same interval. Always the same pitch. We now know what that sound likely was: an isochronic frequency, used in modern brain entrainment, capable of altering brainwave states. Today it's used in sleep studies, meditation tech, even military psychological training. But in 1857, this wasn't healing. This was programming. Children would be woken, spoken to, given phrases to repeat, and then sent back to sleep. The repetition wasn't discipline, it was encoding. They weren't being taught. They were being rewired. And if this sounds too far-fetched, consider this. Modern corporations have filed patents for audio-based behavioral correction. And many of those techniques? Mirrors of what was found in the Sullivan logs. How far back do you think this goes? Final one for this batch. And it cuts deep. One of the recovered journals from the estate, believed to be written by Isadora Sullivan herself, was partially decrypted in 1938. It described her process, not of punishment, not of parenting, but of divine sculpting. She wrote that children were soft clay and could be shaped by rhythm, restriction, and reward. Her goal wasn't obedience. It was transformation. To strip away the noise of the self and leave behind a vessel that could be filled by something else. Something greater. She refers to this force as the echo beneath. Not a god. Not a demon. But a pattern. A frequency that lives beneath consciousness. A voice that only the broken can hear. You've heard enough now to understand. This was never about a single family. It was about what they unlocked. And what they unlocked never went back to sleep. After the fire, the land was marked unsellable by a private council of city officials, none of whom were elected. You won't find this in municipal archives. The only record is a worn field map dated 1864, stamped restricted, for observation only. No further context. But here's what followed. Between 1865 and 1879, 5 surveyors who entered the area to document post-war boundaries all went missing. Every single one. Their final entries? Each described a hum beneath the dirt and dreams of children singing in languages no man should know. Those were their words. Not poetic metaphor. Literal diary entries. In 1880, the federal government seized the land and declared it protected under the Historical Preservation Act. 32 years before that act even existed. Which means someone knew. Someone knew that what lay beneath wasn't destroyed, it was dormant. And dormancy is just rest between phases. So what did they do? They didn't destroy the Sullivan blueprint. They scaled it. The name Catherine Brell means nothing to most people. A schoolteacher in Oklahoma. Died in 1917. But her journal, discovered sealed inside a false bottom desk in 2003, offers something horrifying, an exact match of Sullivan methodology in a rural discipline academy over 60 years later. The routines, the sleep disruption, the use of nonverbal commands, the carving of symbols into floorboards. She even wrote of using frequency-based immersion to create obedience in children deemed resistant to societal structure. The phrase that repeats throughout her entries? The Sullivan rhythm. This isn't some isolated echo. This is systemized. Brell wasn't insane. She was trained, groomed, and deployed into a lower-class community to refine the ritual without suspicion. And if you think that sounds paranoid, explain why the school burned down in 1918, with all its records locked in a fireproof room. A room that's still incinerated. Explain why the parents of those children were later diagnosed with mass hysteria, and never questioned again. The template survived, and the hands using it just changed gloves. Let's stop calling it a story. This is a code of operations, and it evolved. In 1949, a military psychiatrist named Dr. Harold Meeks gave testimony under sealed court-martial documents regarding something he called Project Latchkey. It was a proposed civilian conditioning system designed for implementation in educational institutions. The goal was to foster generational psychological compliance using benign triggers. The documents were destroyed, but one photocopy of a line diagram survived. At the center of the schema? The Sullivan Enneagram. 9 points. One inverted core. The same exact symbol carved into the basement walls in 1857. Why would a U.S. military contractor use a forgotten 19th-century child abuse sigil in mid-century behavioral science? Unless it wasn't forgotten. Unless it never stopped being used. These programs didn't vanish. They were absorbed, folded into defense initiatives, school policies, behavioral health rubrics. And every time they got caught, they just renamed the project. You want to know what real power looks like? It's not men with guns. It's men who can rewrite your trauma into curriculum. At this point, you're probably wondering, why children? Why are they always the target? The answer isn't simple, but it is horrifying. Children are the most programmable biological systems on Earth. Their brains operate in theta state longer than adults, meaning they absorb without filtration. That's what imagination is. It's a doorway without a lock. And someone, centuries ago, learned that if you paired repetition with pain and then layered it with affection, you could rewrite identity permanently. The Sullivan method didn't end with discipline. It reconstructed belief. It embedded false memories. It installed rule sets, invisible instructions that governed action, thought, emotion. The children didn't escape the house. They became extensions of it. And here's where it gets personal. If you were raised in a high-control environment, religious, academic, military, even corporate, you may already have fragments of these rule sets inside you. Fear of questioning authority? Fear of being different? Feeling like love has to be earned by obedience? You weren't born with that. Someone installed it. In 1974, a reclusive researcher named Miriam Stone published an obscure thesis under a pseudonym. Only 13 copies were printed. It was titled, Echoes in the Walls, Neural Harmonics and the Repeating Symbolism of Subconscious Architecture. Sounds like academic nonsense, right? Until you realize, it mapped over 200 institutions, schools, hospitals, orphanages, that were built with identical blueprints. Symmetrical layouts, centralized basements, 9-point halls, spiral staircases arranged in reverse Fibonacci patterns. Each blueprint contained unmarked rooms, often listed on paper but never built above ground. Stone called them null chambers. Her conclusion? That these buildings weren't just spaces. They were conductors, designed to house and transmit a specific energetic frequency tied to obedience, isolation, and neuroplasticity manipulation. One of those buildings was built 60 feet from where the Sullivan Manor once stood. You think trauma doesn't echo? Stone did. And she vanished 3 months after publication. In 2012, a private archive in France released fragments of a letter written by Isadora Sullivan in her final year. It was sent to a now untraceable address in Vienna. The handwriting is sharp, clear, controlled, as if she'd written the same sentences 1,000 times before. The letter says, "The rhythm was perfect. We began with 12 and lost 2. Then 19. Then 23. We reached the threshold. The transformation holds if the pattern is undisturbed. Pain every 3rd night. Light deprivation every 6th. Food irregular. Voice monotone. Then praise. Then sleep. The silence is no longer silence. It speaks now. We listen. It enters them clean. Unresisted. I believe we were chosen. No remorse. No madness. Just precision. And a quiet pride. She wasn't hiding what she'd done. She believed she was fulfilling a formula passed down, perhaps for centuries. A ritual beyond religion. A system of mental transmutation. The horror isn't that she believed it. The horror is, it worked. This is where everything shifts. In 2020, a Freedom of Information request accidentally unsealed a single satellite image, taken by a reconnaissance drone in 2004 over uninhabited land west of Austin. The photo was flagged for unusual ground heat and geomagnetic distortion. Guess what was beneath it? The Sullivan site. Still sealed. Still untouched. But one thing had changed. The seal had been reopened. Briefly. Rewelded. But not professionally. The surrounding soil had shifted. Something, or someone, had gone back in. And then left. No official records. No construction permits. No explanation. Which raises one final question. What was retrieved? Because if someone went through the trouble to hide all of this for over 150 years, and then returned when no one was looking, it means this was never about the past. It was about what the past was protecting. Power doesn't scream. It whispers. It doesn't announce itself with flags or armies. It hides in committees, in foundations, in smiling men with expensive pens and untouchable pensions. In 1986, the Bailey Institute for Child Wellness launched a behavioral pilot program in 3 U.S. cities. It claimed to study early childhood stress patterns. But the funding trail leads to an account tied to the now-defunct Wren Development Group, a shell entity traced back to, yes, Augustus Wren's estate. The program focused on 3 pillars: sleep interruption, language restriction, and something they called empathic distance modeling. It ran for 18 months. Parents were never told their children were being observed through two-way mirrors. Never informed that classroom acoustics included subliminal frequencies tuned to 7 Hz. What does this mean? It means the Sullivan rhythm didn't die in 1857. It was institutionalized. The pattern still works. And now they had labs, data, and liability waivers. The children from that study? 78% showed signs of attachment disorder. 42% were later institutionalized. Not because of the trauma, but because they wouldn't conform. Let that sink in. They broke children. Then punished them for breaking wrong. Here's something you weren't supposed to see. In 1991, a patent was filed under U.S. number US 5123894A. The title? Silent Subliminal Presentation System. It allows audio suggestions to be embedded beneath ambient noise, bypassing conscious perception and targeting subconscious brainwave patterns. The language in the filing is chilling, used for behavior modification, attention control, or sleep state suggestion. Guess what symbol appears in the inventor's company seal? The Sullivan Enneagram. 9 points. Inverted center. You can't make this up. Now think. How many times have you felt a sudden emotional shift while scrolling through reels? While watching an ad you don't remember? While lying awake at 3 a.m., heart pounding for no reason? This tech isn't future. It's past repackaged. What the Sullivans tested with chains and praised they now run through headphones and screens. And what's worse? You might not even want to resist anymore. Because once obedience becomes comfort, freedom feels like a threat. Let's pull the thread on modern figures. A man named Dr. Cecil Harmon appeared in a 2009 TEDx event. He spoke about trauma-informed education. Polite. Charismatic. Applauded. What no one knew. His great-grandmother was Dahlia Wren, granddaughter of Augustus. In a private email leak posted to an underground forum in 2021, Harmon described the rhythm theory as a necessary step in evolving public compliance systems. He compared children to biological terminals and referred to disruptive empathy as the primary virus in modern pedagogy. Read that again. He's calling empathy a virus. He's calling programming a cure. And these are the people designing your policies, training your educators, advising your institutions. The Sullivans don't wear black dresses anymore. They wear badges. They sit on boards. And they've been at this so long they've stopped hiding. Because the only thing more powerful than secrecy is normalization. By now you might feel rage, disgust, maybe even helplessness. Good. That means your programming is cracking. But if you think this ends with old families and broken institutions, you're still only halfway down. Because what if I told you that yes, you, might have already been tested? Let me explain. In 2015, a social media platform, unnamed here for legal reasons, ran an internal study across 6 million users. The goal? Test emotional inducement patterns through variable reward scroll models. Translation? They wanted to see if they could make you feel joy, fear, arousal, or dread on command. And the triggers? Color shifts, frame pacing, slight pitch variations in embedded audio. Where did they get the model for that? A leaked internal memo lists the framework as Sullivan Cadence A3. That's not a coincidence. That's continuity. So if you've ever stared at your screen unable to stop, if you've ever felt anxiety with no cause, or felt your thoughts weren't quite yours, you've been there. Not in the basement, but in the echo of its design. Want proof? Try this. Right now, stop scrolling. Turn off the lights. Sit in silence for 90 seconds. And listen. There's a sound. A low hum. Maybe from your fridge. Maybe from your wiring. Maybe not. That hum? It's 7.83 Hertz. The Schumann resonance, the Earth's natural electromagnetic frequency. Now ask yourself, why does every Sullivan document reference retuning subjects away from it? Because 7.83 Hz grounds your nervous system, promotes critical thought, aligns your brain to the same frequency it was born into. But if they disrupt that rhythm, if they raise your frequency to beta dominance, you stop questioning, you obey, you scroll, you sleep, you shop, you submit. That's the real science of control. Not chains, frequencies. Now, I want you to remember this phrase. The chains were not broken. They were redesigned. Say it again in the comments. Loud, unfiltered. You're not just typing. You're anchoring your mind to the truth. This channel isn't for sleepwalkers. It's for the ones who wake up screaming. The ones who feel the hum and know it's not just noise. The ones who understand that history is never buried. It is encoded. Say the phrase twice. It's how we find each other in the algorithm's fog. Because this video is more than a story. It's a mirror. And if you've made it this far, your reflection has changed. Let's look at what they're really afraid of. Not exposure. Not lawsuits. Not rebellion. They fear coherence. A human mind aligned with itself. Aware of its trauma. Aware of its programming. And unafraid to feel. Why? Because a coherent mind can't be enslaved. A coherent mind remembers its pain, but doesn't obey it. It feels fear, but acts anyway. It sees the chain, and chooses not to wear it. The Sullivan method was always about disruption of coherence. That's why they broke children, rewrote language, scattered identity. Because a fragmented person is easy to lead. But here's the truth. You don't need to be perfect to be coherent. You just need to see the cage before they pad the walls. And right now, you see it. In 1999, a mural was unveiled at a private educational institute in Northern California. Commissioned by a prestigious think tank, it was titled, Harmony Through Structure. But look closer. 9 children, arranged in a circle, eyes closed, hands bound by red thread. In the background, a white farmhouse, a wraparound porch, and in its basement window, a flicker of gold. Sound familiar? Now here's the twist. The artist, when asked about the mural's meaning, said this. It's about hidden patterns in childhood conditioning. About how we're taught to mistake the cage for a hug. A week after that interview, the mural was removed. Quietly. No explanation. But archived satellite data shows something chilling. The mural wasn't painted on a wall. It was painted over a door. A sealed, bricked entryway leading to the Institute's foundation. And when ground-penetrating radar was used in 2020, that foundation matched the Sullivan Enneagram. 9 rooms. Spiral descent. Same signature. Same song. Same silence. Now let's talk about the black table. A term whispered in documents never meant for public eyes. Not a literal table, a council. 6 men. 3 women. All anonymous. connected only through encrypted correspondences traced back to Cold War intelligence groups and early culture experiments. Their goal? Long-term cultural obedience engineering, not through violence, but through aesthetic integration. Let me explain. If they could encode the Sullivan rhythm into architecture, into education, into media, they wouldn't need prisons. They'd make people build their own. Your favorite childhood show? Watch it muted. Look at the flashing patterns, the unnatural pacing, the subliminal hierarchy cues. That hit viral video with the catchy jingle? Track the key frequency. It flirts with 14 Hz, overstimulation range, obedience through dopamine. And the biggest lie? You thought it was your idea to keep watching. But it wasn't. It was theirs. Let's go back to the basement one more time. Not the one in Austin. The one inside you. Because if you were ever told to be quiet when you wanted to scream, if you were ever punished for questioning, if your childhood rhythm was shame and reward, silence and sudden warmth, you already know the Sullivan system. They didn't chain your body. They taught you to chain yourself. That's how real control works. It leaves no bruises, just blueprints. But here's where they failed. Because sometimes, the children remember. In 2023, a nonprofit called Recalibrate began offering trauma-informed workshops for adults raised in authoritarian systems. They expected 300 attendees in their first year. They got 43,000. Why? Because people are waking up. Because they feel something beneath the noise. Because the hum never really leaves you. Recalibrate discovered something fascinating. When participants were exposed to 7.83 Hz tones for 15 minutes before sleep, their dreams shifted. Memories surfaced. Trauma untangled. People remembered names, rooms, faces they'd never consciously known. One woman described a house she'd never seen before. Drawn in detail. Same porch. Same basement window. 3 others in the session confirmed the house matched their dream. They didn't grow up together. They never met before that night. So the question becomes, how many people carry Sullivan echoes inside them? How many dreams are inherited, not imagined? And what happens when we all start remembering? There's a final layer to all this. And it's not pretty. A 2021 neuroscience report revealed that long-term exposure to specific rhythmic trauma can restructure neural hierarchies. Not just temporarily, permanently. It builds loyalty loops, dissociation walls, obedience reflexes. But here's the terrifying part. Once those structures are installed, the subject feels guilt when they try to disobey. The programming protects itself. So if you've ever felt shame for saying no, if you've ever apologized for simply wanting freedom, that's not your flaw. That's the system defending its script. They didn't just want your body. They wanted your voluntary compliance, your internal enforcer, your mind weaponized against itself. But here's the truth that terrifies them. Programming can be reversed. Rhythms can be rewritten. And you don't need a savior. You need coherence. So let me ask you right now, are you ready to reclaim your pattern? To become more dangerous than 1,000 institutions? Because a coherent soul can burn down centuries of lies with a single phrase. Candles, say it again in the comments and say it loud. The chains were not broken. They were redesigned. Once more. This time for who you're becoming. The chains were not broken. They were redesigned. They buried this knowledge. But you resurrected it. Final piece of this arc. What the Sullivans did wasn't isolated evil. It was a template of control. One that's been mirrored in labs, in churches, in classrooms. But the fact that you've made it here means you're not sleeping anymore. This channel isn't just about stories. It's about sovereignty. So if this hit something in you, if you felt it in your spine, your gut, your dreams, then subscribe. Not for views, but so you don't lose your place in this descent. Because what's coming next makes the Sullivans look like amateurs. This is only layer 1. You want to know what true evil is? It's not violence. It's not gore. It's not what they show in horror movies. True evil is structural. It's dressed in uniforms and policies, syllabi and terms of service. It doesn't scream, it standardizes. And as of 2024, over 117 educational institutions in the U.S. have adopted a behavioral alignment protocol, originally developed by a think tank named Cadence Group International. Look them up. You won't find much. But dig through old LLC registries and you'll discover it was founded by Graham Evren, a descendant of Isadora Sullivan. Evren was obsessed with rhythm-based pedagogy and believed the human psyche could be rhythmically harmonized to artificial moral architecture. His system is already in use. Your child's morning assembly? That pacing, that controlled breathing, that emotional anchoring to flag, voice, command? It's not patriotism. It's patterning. Evren didn't want to raise citizens. He wanted to engineer internalized submission. And every time a child bites their tongue instead of speaking truth, or feels pride for obeying fear, that's the Sullivan lineage winning again. Let's crack open the final vault. In 2021, a declassified CIA document, Project Clovercut, outlined experiments in symbolic disassociation using mythic transference. Long title, simple purpose. Implant artificial fears and false memories using symbols that bypass logic and speak directly to the survival brain. They tested it in conflict zones. But what no one talks about is how those symbols are already all around you. Look at corporate logos. 9 points, spirals, fragmented triangles. All echoing Sullivan's original sigils. These aren't designs. They're keys, triggers that bypass your analytical mind and whisper to your primitive core. Submit, comply, conform. When you see that symbol and suddenly forget what you were angry about, that's not coincidence. That's trauma familiarity. Because when abuse is patterned into childhood, comfort becomes confusion and fear becomes home. These are not ancient symbols. They are living frequencies and they are activated every time you don't notice them. Here's what they've been hiding all along, and why everything from the Sullivan basement to Mkultra to modern UX design ties together. You are programmable. But you are also programmable by yourself. That's what terrifies them. Not the broken minds, they love those. They study those. What they fear are the outliers. The ones who recover. The ones who remember. The ones who wake up, connect the dots and realize, you can code your rhythm. You can uninstall Sullivan. You can overwrite fear. And you don't need gurus or gods or pills to do it. Just pattern interruption. Start asking yourself, whose voice is this when I say I'm not enough? Who taught me to shrink? Who profits from my guilt? Because that voice was installed. And now, you get to rip it out. No ceremony. No applause. Just decision. Because coherence doesn't come from healing. It comes from seeing. Let me ask you something that no one ever dares. Who benefits from you being obedient? Who wins when you doubt yourself? Who profits when you're too numb to resist? I'll tell you who, the descendants of Sullivan. Not just by blood. By ideology. These are the architects of modern obedience. They run schools that suppress dissent. Corporations that throttle individuality. Platforms that reward silence and penalize depth. They whisper to your nervous system that you're safest when you're unseen. But they're wrong. You're not meant to be muted. You're meant to fracture the architecture. Your voice, raw, imperfect, inconvenient, is the most dangerous weapon against engineered control. So say this out loud wherever you are and mean it. I remember the basement. And I refuse to go back. Let your nervous system hear you disobey. Let it echo through every trauma-built wall they left in you. Because you don't escape by running. You escape by reclaiming the rhythm. And once it's yours, they can't touch you again. This is where we end. Not with fear, but with fire. The Sullivan family story is not just a historical horror. It's the blueprint of control, disguised, normalized, and upgraded across every generation. But now you know. You've seen the echoes, felt the rhythm. And if you made it to the end of this video, you're not just a viewer. You're part of a secret circle. The ones who hear the hum, who wake up in the middle of the night and know something's wrong. This channel isn't for everyone. It's for the broken who refuse to stay broken. The fragmented who demanded truth. If you haven't already, subscribe now, not to follow us but to remember yourself. Because this rabbit hole goes deeper. Much deeper. But you're not falling anymore. Now you're walking it awake. And when they ask you what happened, tell them the truth. The rhythm tried to claim me, but I built my own.